In this video, we're going to talk about the Han Dynasty at its apogee, the height of its power, particularly the reign of Han Wudi and his successors. Han Wudi was the emperor who flexed the Han Dynasty's military muscles the most effectively and in the most widespread way. We talked last time about the rule of Wan and Jing, this golden age in which the government practiced a type of an economic policy that we call Wu Wei. Well, really, Wu Wei is not just an economic policy, it's a Taoist concept. If you've heard of the philosophy of Taoism, created by another of the scholars of the 100 schools, Lao Tzu. We didn't talk about it too much, but the general principle behind Taoism is Wu Wei, non-action. Not acting, right? The famous adage from the Tao Te Ching, why does the ocean rule over the rivers? Because it is content to lie beneath them. Right? So by not striving, not attempting to do something, you end up triumphing. Right? You triumph by getting rid of your desires and ceasing ambition and activity. So from the Taoist point of view, the way to govern, because the Taoists believed, like the Confucians, that human beings were inherently good, for a human being to be evil, they had to be corrupted later on. The Taoists believed that the government that governed best governed the least, leaving people alone, not making laws, not involving yourselves in the people's affairs, allowing them to sort out their own beliefs. And this worked very well with the state Confucianism during the reign of Wan and Jing, because like the state Confucianists, the Taoists also advocated letting people keep the vast majority of their wealth, maintaining the taxes at an absolute minimum, government interference in the economy largely to a minimum, and as a result, people prospered. Now, one thing I will talk about when it comes to government intervention is something called the ever-normal granary. This is an agricultural system that would not be put into place in another society until Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s in the United States. What the government would do is they would deliberately fix the price of grain, not through the kind of arbitrary ways that, for example, the Roman Emperor Diocletian in the West attempted to do in the late 3rd century, where he just said, well, we're fixing the prices. A bushel of wheat is this much. A cask of wine is this much, and you can't charge anymore. And of course, that has nothing to do with supply and demand. So you just end up with this huge black market. The ancient Chinese understood supply and demand. They understood this law. So what the government would do is when there was a bumper crop and there was lots of rice and wheat and barley that might go to waste, and then this was even true of salted, preserved meat, but they would, and alcohol as well, they would buy up the surplus, they would store it away, and the goal, they would keep buying it until the price had gone back up to a reasonable level. When there was a drought and there were shortages, the government would start releasing grain, meat, alcohol into the population. And as it released these foodstuffs, the price would go down, right? Because in a drought, in a famine, there's scarcity, the demand is up, the supply is down, so the price goes sky high. Well, the government would bring down the price by releasing the food that it had stored away. So they basically they would buy when the price was low, and then they would give it to the population when the price was high. So that would help to maintain a moderate level of prices for agricultural products. And this helped ensure economic stability and harmony for the millions of farmers who provided the viability of the empire. But other than this particular type of interference, the imperial government attempted to stay away from economics before Wu Di. They had attempted to maintain, Emperor 1 slashed taxes to 1 out of 30. Jing slashed it to 1 out of 60. Right, so it was at about not even 1.5% when Emperor Jing's rule ended. Right? So the vast majority of the wealth that was being produced was remaining in the hands of the people. And this caused the population to skyrocket, and it caused the economy to expand. People were driven to clear new fields. And of course, this also meant in southern China to colonize new lands and to do battle as settlers with the non-Han Chinese populations, either overwhelming them through mixing with them, or driving them out, or even annihilating them in some instances. You have different phases, levels of the colonization of southern China. When Han Wudi took the throne, the government's coffers were filled to the brim. The government surplus was seemingly inexhaustible. Wan and Jing had left the state much wealthier than they had received it. And as a result, Wu Di had all of these resources that had not been available to previous emperors. And instead of simply hoarding the wealth, Wu Di wanted to use the wealth. He wanted to use the wealth to fix what he saw were permanent problems that needed to be dealt with. I had mentioned about the tributary system, how non-Chinese rulers would give the Chinese emperor goods. They would visit the Chinese court, and they would do homage. The Chinese emperor would give them luxury items and other goods that were too technologically advanced to be produced in their homelands, and give them titles so that when they went back to their homelands, say in the different Yue kingdoms to the south, that you would have the legitimacy of the Han emperor supporting your rule, and that would elevate you above the other warlords in your local, from your ethnic group. Well, there was an exception to this, and those are the Xiongnu. Xiongnu were the ancestors of the Mongols. They lived beyond the Great Wall. They followed around herds of sheep, camels, horses, from watering hole to watering hole. They were extraordinarily warlike. They could mass huge cavalry armies very quickly. They could march very quickly. They could strike. They could assemble and strike very rapidly and then dissipate before the much less mobile Han Chinese army could mount a response. And they had at points broken through the Great Wall. So Han Wudi wanted a permanent solution to this problem. Now, previous emperors, since the defeat of Liu Bang in his expeditionary force when it was defeated by the Xiongnu, what the Han emperors had done is they had taken Chinese princesses and they had married them to chieftains, particularly to the Chanyu, kind of the equivalent of a Khan, right, the predecessor of the great Khans. Chinese women were heavily in demand in these steppe cultures because from many of these warlords, these Chinese women were very cultured and deeply considered physically very beautiful, refined, and so it was a great point of pride for one of these chieftains to have a Chinese bride, particularly one from a noble clan or even the imperial family. That elevated him above his rivals, and it would also boost his political support amongst his own followers. So what the Chinese emperors would do, like Wan and Jing, is they would send young women to be brides of these warlords, and in exchange, you could support one warlord, not support another, and ultimately pit them against each other, so that they're fighting each other to compete for your approval, which you show by bestowing them with wives. This system of using Chinese princesses to lure various barbarian warlords into conflict with each other and to secure peace in northern China was called the Heqin system, or peaceful marriage system. Emperors had practiced this system because they felt that it was easier and more cost effective to send these princesses along with some gifts and titles to these different warlords and buy them off instead of paying the expense necessary to confront them. Well, Wu Di enjoyed a treasury that was, the profits were unprecedented, and he had massive amounts of money, and he was outraged that this system had continued. He thought it was shameful that the emperors were sending members of the imperial family to go marry these barbarians. So he decided that instead of giving them wives, he would subjugate them militarily. And so he waged war throughout every corner of his empire, including to the north. Emperor Wu Di consulted with his military officers and his officials, and he determined that he was going to shift China's traditional imperial policy, foreign policy of dealing with what they perceived of as barbarian peoples through diplomacy, bribery, marriage, and begin dealing with these problems with military force. He raised a very large military of professional crossbowmen. On top of this, because he had planned to go to war with the Xiongnu, he decided to create a massive cavalry arm. So he sent envoys beyond the Great Wall to friendly tribes to obtain thousands and thousands of horses. And these horses were, over a period of several years, bred in very large numbers. And he created one of the most effective cavalry armies in the history of the world up to that point. Wu Di's armies were very successful. The armies that invaded the far south subjugated the kingdoms of Minyue and Nanyue, and these kingdoms were led by people called the Yue, the ethnic group of the Yue, who are the ancestors of the modern Vietnamese. If you look at the name Nanyue, which was the Chinese name for this kingdom, it's the basis of the word Vietnam. The pronunciation Viet and Yue are describing the same ethnic group, Yue simply being the ancient Chinese name for these people, and of course Nan meaning southern, right? The Nanman, southern barbarians. So as these Han armies are moving south, destroying these southern kingdoms, you have Han Chinese settlers advancing by the thousands in their wake. They're establishing towns. They're engaging in intensive agriculture. They're adopting the rice agriculture of southern China, except they're doing so in a much more land-intensive manner. So you see these huge rice yields being produced. And you see Han Chinese culture, including Confucianism, moving south. So the commanderies that the Han Dynasty set up under Wu Di would form the basis for the later political states that were established in what's now Vietnam. The same kind of process happened in Korea. I'm not going to get into it into too great detail right now. We're going to have a unit on Korea later on. But the armies of Han Wu Di invaded and established 4 commanderies of the Han Dynasty in what's now North Korea. And it would be these commanderies that would later go on to form the political basis for the later historical Korean kingdoms. So you have Confucianism moving into what's now Vietnam, moving into Korea, and establishing itself as the philosophical basis for these cultures, which is why these concepts like filial piety are so important in cultures that are otherwise relatively different. Han Wu Di would have his most contentious battles and really his greatest success when battling the Xiongnu to the northwest. The emperor sent his 2 most capable generals, Wei Qing and Huo Qubing, the latter of which was only 18 years of age, and they won victory after victory against the Xiongnu. They defeated them so thoroughly that the Xiongnu were forced to retreat into Siberia, and many of them died from starvation. on top of their losses in battle. Some anthropologists and historians believe that the Xiongnu resurfaced later on, re-entering history as the Huns, who ended up moving west and under their leader Attila ended up ravaging much of the Roman Empire before the Romans finally defeated them at the Battle of Chalons in the 4th century. So this great victory of Wu Di and his victorious generals had long-lasting repercussions. Wu Di was victorious, but not without great cost. The Xiongnu were masters of cavalry warfare, and about 80% of the horses that the Chinese had brought with them in their massive military expedition in Xiongnu territory in what's now Inner Mongolia in China ended up being killed or dying of disease or starvation. The emperor, who was profiting from a more secure long-distance trade, decided that he wanted to maintain a permanent military presence in the steppe. So large fortresses were created in order to house thousands of crossbowmen, in order to pacify this vast expanse. The soil was not good for farming, so the soldiers could not grow their own food. The food had to be imported from the south. So this was very expensive. Wu Di ends up sending soldiers as far west as the Pamirs in what's now Afghanistan, establishing diplomatic relations with local rulers, convincing or forcing non-Chinese rulers to accept Chinese suzerainty over their territories, and establishing commercial contracts. So the Han Dynasty goes from being very inward-looking to being a military superpower, and possibly the most dominant military superpower in the world. Certainly, at least one of two. When you have Rome in the west, China in the east, and of course, this is the period where the two great powers would begin to interact with one another. And I'll talk more about that as we talk about the Silk Road later on. A student, in fact, had mentioned in one of the posts about the Chinese encountering the Testudo formation of the Roman legion, this unit of Romans having been taken captive by the Parthians after the Battle of Carrhae. I'm going to make probably a video about this specific topic, so I won't get into it today. But just know that it was during this period of time with the establishment of the Silk Road that you start to see vast riches pouring east and massive amounts of quality goods moving west. The trade was generally east to west, not west to east. The further west you went, the less exports there were. In general, Chinese aristocrats didn't really value goods from the west. The goods that they most valued eventually would be European wine, because fruit wine was a novelty. It was a way to show out that you had this really exotic wine that many Chinese felt was kind of distasteful because it's not made from grain, it's made from fruit. On top of this, horses, particularly horses from Central Asia, such as Fergana horses, very, very, very highly valued because these were strong and fast war horses. And for many Chinese aristocrats, after the reign of Wu Di, horsemanship, riding, horse archery become skills to show out with at court during parties. And of course, the state needs able cavalrymen to man these large posts on the steppe and to ensure that none of the other steppe nomads get the idea of revolting against Chinese rule. Wu Di excelled in dealing with China's external enemies. However, he didn't neglect internal affairs either. In 124 BC, he established the first university in world history when he created the Imperial Academy with the purpose of providing the state with scholar officials. There was a shortage of educated, literate scribes who could administer the provinces on behalf of the emperor. The university was designed to teach the Confucian classics, to produce the kind of men who had the intellectual and moral foundation to produce social harmony and prosperity. Wu Di was very distrustful of the nobility. When he first became emperor, there were rumors that he would be an ineffective emperor due to the fact that many people argued that he was possibly infertile. This was later proven to not be the case. Nonetheless, there were conspiracies aimed at him, at replacing him with one of his relatives in the name of his alleged infertility. So there were many plots against him. And he looked at the nobility as a threat to his own autocratic power. So what he wanted to do is he wanted to completely get the nobility out of the administration of the empire. Instead of having the sons of the nobility take these exams and become scholar officials, he attempted to go throughout the empire, find talented men from middle and lower class backgrounds, bring them in through the Imperial Academy, and then when they're educated and they're scholar officials, they will owe their position entirely to him. They will have no political connections outside of him, and so he will have great authority over the organs of government. And this, he was very successful at this. This is how he was able to dominate so much of his own society. For example, when we looked at the readings, the discourses on salt and iron, Wu Di set up monopolies on salt, on iron, on alcohol. The reason he did this is so that the government alone could produce these goods that were vital for life. You needed salt to preserve meat, and of course you need salt to live. You needed alcohol, not just as a recreational drug, but as medicine, right? As a way to preserve calories long term. So by the government taking control of these industries, the government was able to rake in massive profits, which he needed to replenish his armies. Unfortunately for Wu Di, he went overboard in appointing men of good morals and filial background, because many of these men, despite the fact that they owe their positions completely to him, would object strenuously to these monopolies, arguing that they went against the previous tradition of Wu Wei, of leaving the economy alone, of not putting undue burdens on the people, and they actually protested the creation of these monopolies. However, Wu Di was insistent on maintaining them, and throughout his reign, the government would control the trade in these items. Wu Di argued that the military exigencies required it, right? So it would be too great a disservice to the empire, from his point of view, to abandon these monopolies and have the Xiongnu resurge in power. The Han era is one of the most dynamic eras in human history in terms of technological innovation and economic growth. Some of the technologies that came out of the Han Dynasty were the wheelbarrow being a product of necessity created by so many Chinese farmers putting so much new land under cultivation during the great period of growth during the rule of Wan and Jing. And with the wheelbarrow, you would think it would be something that would be kind of obvious to people because we're so used to it. But it wasn't obvious. It didn't exist before this period of time, and it would revolutionize farm work all over the world afterwards. On top of this, you had the invention of paper. The effects of that are obvious. You have the use of water wheels in grinding grain, the use of water wheels in producing bellows for furnaces. The Chinese smiths were able to get temperatures hot enough to make wrought iron and eventually to make steel for the first time. You had the development of the chuan, which would later enter the English language as the junk, one of the most longest lasting models of ship in human history. On top of this, you'd have other naval innovations, such as the first versions of the compass, which changed navigation forever. You had the development of the steel-tip plow, another agricultural advancement. You also had the development of the seed drill. In mathematics, you had a number of advances, including the discovery of square roots, the discovery of negative numbers. So there's this massive intellectual fermentation going on top of this great period of technological development. You also had development in the humanities. People began to write histories in abundance. One of the greatest historians of Chinese history, Sun Xian, was from this period of time. In fact, he ends up crossing Emperor Wu Di, and Wu Di ends up actually having him castrated for not portraying him in a flattering enough light in one of his histories. But all manner of writing, poetry, history, great landscape paintings that have been popular for centuries in Chinese art began to develop during this period of time. However, just like with every other civilization in human history, you have a rise, you have a zenith, and you have a decline. And the Han Dynasty was no exception. The Western Han, the first phase of the Han Dynasty, began to decline after the reign of Wu Di, when subsequent emperors would search for more and more sources of funds to fund military expeditions. They would in turn end up debasing their coinage. By debasing their coinage, we mean that they would take the precious metal contents of their coins, silver and gold, and they would reduce the amount of precious metals in them and replace those with base metals, because you can't have a fully silver coin. It would be so malleable as to be impractical. So you have to put some tin in there. You increase the amount of tin, you decrease the amount of silver. That allows you to mint more coins so you can pay your bills. The problem is that by minting more coins, reducing the silver content in every coin, you end up causing inflation. And this is what happened in the Roman economy as well. And it destroyed the Roman economy in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And this would end up destroying the Han economy as well. So this growth, we begin to see massive inflation take over, erode economic trust. On top of this, you have the nobility gaining more and more power. This movement by Han Wu Di to find men of ability out in the countryside and promote them to high government positions begins to largely be replaced by cliques of nobles operating for their own self-interests. The members of the nobility would end up creating their own massive estates, their own fiefs, which would basically be states within the state where they held near to power. The great nobles would have thousands of so-called guests called ko, who were really private soldiers in their employ. So you would have vast stretches of territory where there was no state power, where it was all the private property of great nobles. And of course, this soon became warlordism. You start to have infighting between these nobles, fighting against the central government. You have natural disasters that are particularly powerful because the state is strapped for cash. There's disunity in society, and so the ability of the government to respond to people's needs was strained. On top of this, as the government struggled to fund its massive military, the government ironically had to retreat from some of its territories in Central Asia, which emboldened many of the barbarian tribes to attempt to attack the interior of China and to break through the Great Wall, the manning of which became more and more difficult over time. As abuses, corruption, disasters, and defeats became more and more common, many scholars began to argue that the Liu, the imperial clan of the Han Dynasty, had lost the mandate of heaven, and in 9 AD, a man named Wang Mang will replace the Han Dynasty and establish the Qin Dynasty. And that's where we're going to start our next video. Thanks for listening.